Hello, everyone. And today I'd like to invite you for another conversation. And this time I have a pleasure of speaking with Norman Blair, who is a yoga teacher, a writer, and someone who wants to take practice into all aspects of our lives. So welcome, Norman, and thank you for joining me here.
It's good to be here.
Oh, lovely. And I'm really excited about chatting with you. As I said before we started this podcast, like I came to your class many, many, many years ago, many years ago, possibly over 20 years ago, maybe not that long, over 15 years ago. And in London, when I was still living in London, just at the beginning of just touching on my yoga teacher journey. And your name always stayed with me. And whenever I see your name on Facebook or in social media, it always kind of comes up with that really nice memory of coming to your yin class.
Thank you.
Pleasure. And I don't know that much about your journey, and I'd love you to share with me and the listeners, how did you end up doing what you're doing right now? How did you start?
So my first ever yoga class was at Bodywise in East London in 1991. And a friend of mine, a bit of a classic beginning, a friend of mine thought it'd be good for me.
Okay.
So she took me along, and it was something like, as I remember, a 4-week course. And then I did the classes and I didn't go back. And that was perhaps a couple of years later. Someone I know was starting to teach, and she needed a group to teach with. So this is 1993. And I thought, yeah, that sounds good. So it was such a great way to learn. There was maybe half a dozen of us in her front room, Finsbury Park. She was very good friends with Nigel, who you'll know through Tara.
Yes.
And I practiced with Oz for maybe 6 years, just once a week, going along to practice. And it was a lovely community way to learn. Is a very, what's that word? An intimate way to learn. So less the industrial approach, more the kind of the connected way. And so practice with Oz, and then I started self-practicing Ashtanga yoga at the end of the 90s with Hamish Hendry at Ashtanga Yoga London. And I can still remember going along to, it was at the Royal Homeopathic Hospital. And I can still have this vague memory. When was it? It was autumn 1999 of going in and seeing all these people do these, what I perceived as very kind of strange things with their bodies. And then a few years later, I was doing probably strange things with my body as well. So that's my kind of yoga journey. And it's interesting because I have been recently kind of reflecting about my life. And I think, one of the strong themes in my life, all my adult life, has been about communicating with others, has been about inquiry, however that might be manifested. And so what happened with yoga practice is that helped me towards a meditation practice. And one of the dates I would use for that would be going to a festival called Buddha Field. So that's when was the first time I went to Buddha Field? Probably 1997, something like that. And then I did a meditation retreat, a Goenka Vipassana meditation retreat in 2000. So if someone asked me, and people do ask me this, they say, would you advise going to a Goenka Vipassana meditation retreat as my first ever meditation retreat? My advice would be probably not. It was like a tough thing to do. So when was that? End of 2000. And then I started teaching yoga in autumn 2001.
Lovely. I mean, I I use so many names and places that come up in my memory. You know, my first yoga class was at Bodywise as well. And I, you know, I didn't go to Vipassana retreat. I actually learned with the Friends of Western Buddhist Order. They were running Bodywise. I learned kind of mindfulness and loving kindness with them.
So my
That was with them.
my partner is an order member
Okay.
within them, and as you know, Buddha Field is run by them, but it's run by what I describe as their hippie wing, which is what I'm kind of drawn to. So that's been, there's a kind of, what could you describe it? A kind of a countercultural element within me throughout all my adult life. And I very much would identify with the hippie wing rather than the business suit wing.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So, you know, you were talking about Ashtanga. Funny enough, yeah, I did Ashtanga Mysore style for quite a few years as well. But how did you end up doing Yin yoga? Because the Ashtanga and Yin are
Well,
quite different practices.
but that's the whole point, isn't it?
Mm.
And if someone says to me, all I do is Yin yoga, I would tell them, or I would suggest that they go to the gym and do some weights, or they go to an Ashtanga class, or they go for a run, because it's all about balance, isn't it? So we live in a very yang world, in my view. And this is a world of striving. This is a world of achievement. I remember years ago, someone describing Ashtanga yoga to me. And when they said this to me, I probably got quite defensive. On reflection, they were true in what they were saying. And they described Ashtanga yoga as acquisition yoga. So you climb the postural ladder. And so how far did I get? I got something like a third of the way through the second series.
Okay. That's a little bit further than I did.
I'm really happy these days, and I publicly will say this and say this again and again. There are postures I've retired from, such as, say, once I did headstand, Shasasana, for 15 minutes. And my conclusion after doing it for 15 minutes is I wouldn't advise anyone else to do that. You know, that's not in the Ashtanga series, but postures like, say, Marichasana D, Pashasana. Some of the people listening to this might know Pashasana. If you're unaware of Pashasana, stay in blissful ignorance. Life might be better being ignorant of Pashasana, but certainly they will not happen again for me. And that is fine. So in terms of my relationship with Yin, I first went to a Yin class, funnily enough, at the Manchester Buddhist Centre. And maybe this is going to be one of our themes in our conversation, Anita, that around Friends of Western Buddhist Order, which is now called Tri Ratna. So I went to the Manchester Buddhist Centre in autumn 2001, and they were running weekends for Buddhist practitioners who were also yoga practitioners. And I'm very much into weaving webs. And if someone, and this is something that has, and you've probably seen this as well, of people who just meditated, and it's not that good for your body.
Yes, the knees and the lower back problems. Yes,
you need to move. However we define the movement, whether it's qigong, whether it's yoga, whether it's this, that, you need to move. As much as yoga practitioners need to have abilities to sit with stuff. I remember someone telling me how their meditation practice was they would sit for maybe 10 or 15 minutes after having done Ashtanga. And from my view, and I know other people will not agree with this, and that's of course fine, but from my view, it's like you just spent maybe an hour and a half really kind of tuning your body and getting these releases in your body, really getting connected to all the sensations in your body. And then you sit, and it might be you're just sitting in a level of bliss. Whereas for me, I kind of see a meditation practice more as just sitting with as is, which obviously can include bliss, but also can include boredom, innumerable distractions. So going to the Manchester Buddhist Centre, autumn 2001, and the teacher was a woman called Rosie Coyle, who's now Padma Darshini. And she had been to the West Coast of the US, and she'd studied with Sarah Powers.
Okay. Yes.
So she comes back to Manchester, so big jump from like California to Manchester. She's back in Manchester, and she taught a yin class as part of this weekend. And so there were different teachers, different styles on the weekend, and I was just blown away. This wasn't a practice I'd come across in any other way, really, and just this staying in the poses. And I can still remember doing square, the kind of fire log, cross-legged, but with one leg on top of the other, double pigeon, some people might call it. And it was like, oh my God, it was like agony, but I was a man. I pushed on. I learned. And by nature, I'm a very yang person.
Mm-hmm.
By nature, I have a lot of reactivity. I can be very pushy. I can strive. And so yin has been a beautiful blessing.
Mm.
The teachings within yin of like, slow down, take your time, soften. And this idea of, in contrast, when I said about acquisition yoga, of the poses can just be places where we're exploring our experience. You know, how am I doing right now? And I suppose this comes back to the inquiry. How am I doing? You know, where do I feel this in my body? So yeah, meeting Padma Darshini, and then when was it? 2002, I first met Sarah Powers when she was teaching at Tri Yoga, and I did a weekend with her then, and then a weekend the following year, and then in January 2004, I went on a 10-day training with her in Napa Valley in California. Okay. And she was teaching that with Paul Grilly, so they're teaching together. Mm-hmm. I can still remember Paul saying, and he's saying this kind of jokingly, but he said, oh, don't come to me with your emotions. Go to Sarah with your emotions. Come to me with your anatomy questions. And on that retreat, I met fellow teacher, a woman called Dina Cohen. And Dina and I have practiced and taught together since then, since 2004. Funnily enough, on that same retreat was Bernie Clark.
Oh, okay.
Who, subsequently went on and has taught many, many people yin yoga and has been very influential and a great beacon of light in terms of anatomy and yoga. So yeah, that's kind of my, and when did I start teaching yin? Beginning of 2003. So I started teaching these workshops, which is the one I think that you and your friend came to in London Bridge. Well, the first one was at the Barbican, the YMCA, and then moved them to London Bridge. And then in September 2003, I taught what I think is the first weekly timetabled yin yoga class in London. And that was, again, we're coming back to Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. That was at the North London Buddhist Centre.
Yes.
So there is a real connection, in my view, between yin yoga and meditation. And sometimes I've described yin yoga as a gateway drug for meditation. So by that, I mean, someone comes and says, oh, I can't meditate. And I might say, well, you've just been in butterfly for 5 minutes. And clearly you are distracted because you're human. This is what we all do. We all get distracted. I can remember when I was first teaching yoga, and we would do a short meditation at the end of the class. And I would say, I remember first doing this, I'd say, if you get distracted, and then quite quickly I realized everyone gets distracted. So I dropped the if. When you get distracted, come back to whatever the anchor was. Yeah. So there's a definite crossing over between meditation and yin yoga. Yeah. And I just so appreciate the yin practice. I am so fortunate to have met teachers like Sarah Powers, Paul Grilly. I've also studied quite a lot with Bernie Clark. And what we could look at, because it is like, well, it's 20 years I've been teaching yin. And that kind of, over time, the yin getting more and more and the Ashtanga getting less and less. And I probably, I did say a little bit earlier about retiring from a few Ashtanga poses. I'd probably retire from Ashtanga. I'm 60 years old, and I will definitely do dynamic stuff. I'll do weights, I'll do planks, I'll do like strong, but I don't do the Ashtanga sequence anymore. And I also miss that. And I miss the Ashtanga community, just going along, practicing together, going out for a coffee afterwards. I miss being adjusted by people. I miss that kind of connection. But also something that I'm very clear about, Anita, is sustainability. And my priority is sustainability. And I love this word sustainability because we can apply it to so many different areas. So my sustainability as a practitioner, my sustainability as a teacher, and then let's look at sustainability of our environment. Let's look at the sustainability of our world. And coming back to this idea that this is a yang culture that we're in. And for those listening who might be familiar with the 5 elements or the 5 phases, this is very much, in my opinion, a wood and fire. Yes, so the wood, growth is the God. Like economic growth is the God. It's like getting more and more and more. And when is enough? Yes. And then fire is like, literally, we're in the time of wildfires. Yes. And the frequency and severity of wildfires is increasing, substantially increasing. And for me, a question is, well, how are we going to deal with this? And what are we going to do about it? Yeah. And so that can come back to this idea of taking practices off our mats and into our daily lives. So for myself, I was very heavily involved in political movements and protest groups, in anarchist groups in the 80s and the 90s. And one of the reasons I, to some extent, moved away from them, although my heart has always been there, was feeling that there was too much externality going outwards and not enough aware of the inner work that we all need to do. And the anger needed to be balanced with equanimity. So rather than just being reactive, take a moment, pause. And so we're speaking right now when there's a war going on in the Gaza. And I know there are many different opinions about this. Just going back to the attack on the US in 2001, 9/11. And I just think, what might have happened if, after that terrible attack, when 3,000 people were killed, if there'd been a pause. And the world would have been drawn together in like horror over what had happened, and a kind of compassion for all those lives murdered, and a pause. But instead, there was the reactivity. Instead, there was the I for an eye. And if we have this an eye for an eye, eventually we're all going to be blind.
Well, yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, there are so many things happening around the world, and we do live in a very young society. It has been something that I often talk about, is that feeling of life being relentless. It's like the pandemic, the stuff that happened before. Then there was the pandemic, then there was war in Ukraine, then there was economic crisis. Now it's Gaza and Israel. It's what's happening in there, and it's just, there is no break, as you said, no pause, no kind of, let's just hold on a second, let's take a breath.
I want to say, where are the adults in the room? I want to say, nothing happens in a vacuum.
Always.
That, say, after the awful atrocities of the Hamas attack on the 7th of October, and then the Chief Secretary of the UN said something like, while condemning those atrocities, said nothing happens in a vacuum. And he's been completely condemned by the Israeli government. And nothing happens in a vacuum.
Yes. I think it's also about the history, isn't it? It's not the first thing, it's not the second thing, it's not the third thing, it's the stuff that's been going on for such a long time in so many different ways. I think it's, just like in many other countries and many other parts of the world, it's been going on for so long. And, my thoughts are always going out to people who are caught up in the middle of it, not people who are making those decisions, but people who are on a kind of grassroots level, are impacted by all of this. And, when we talk about trauma and generational trauma and what it does to, the research shows up to 7 generations back and the impact of it, everybody who's there and people connected to those people and those families, that's gonna go on again and again and again, and that will have impact again and on their decision making, on their relationships, on their health. It's kind of, when you start looking at the connectivity, and kind of, the wholeness of it, the context of it, the connections, it's kind of really I want to say overwhelming, but that's not the right word completely. It's such a big thing that it's hard to hold it in the wholeness of it.
Thank you for bringing in the trauma. And I feel that, if we're going to talk specifically about the Gaza and Israel, like, there's a huge amount of trauma there on all sides. And as you said, the people, the civilians, they're the ones being injured, killed, further traumatized. And when we're traumatized, that then means we're more reactive.
Yeah.
And then the reactivity is like taking a can of petrol and pouring it onto the fires of the trauma.
Yeah.
And so on it goes. And we need to be seriously contemplating, how can we release, soften, diffuse these cycles? And we can do this in a multiplicity of different ways. So I think we have to be very clear. There are many, many different ways of doing these things. And so when I talk, say, about practice, I have a broad umbrella. So for me, practice, so I've done a lot of psychotherapy over a long period of time. That is certainly practice. Ashtanga yoga is practice. Going along to Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, also known as Sri Ratna, that's practice. Doing selfless service, this is practice. Many different ways that we can manifest practice. And looking at how we can deal with these situations, part of a way of dealing with them is to see the multiplicity. That, as I said, nothing happens in a vacuum. There are many factors for causing situations, and there are many ways that we can constructively deal with what's happening. So whether that's a meditation practice that gives us some grounding, whether that's going along to a psychotherapist and talking about, and I think we're all traumatized. I think there's obviously many different layers of trauma. I do think that there is what we might describe as post-pandemic trauma. I do think that many, many people, if not pretty much everyone living in somewhere like Israel and the Gaza, are deeply traumatized. I think with Jewish people, there's the huge trauma of the Holocaust.
Yes, the history.
The history, you know, and there's many other much, much smaller threads of trauma that we've experienced as children. You know, however that might have been experienced. And, you know, I can think of different ways that, you know, I personally have had some small traumas. And I think also what we need to be aware of, so this has happened, you know, these events have happened to us. These have caused us to behave in certain ways, and yet still we need to cultivate ways of stopping, ways of pausing. So we can so I suppose in a way that comes back to a yin practice.
However that yin practice looks, isn't it? It's because it could look, as you just said, in so many different ways. It could be just pausing.
Yeah.
It could be just having a quiet cup of tea and listening to the birds. It could be going for a walk. It could be sitting in meditation or doing some yin yoga. Or there's so many different ways of doing it.
I just had the very good fortune to be away for 2 weeks in a caravan down on the Essex coast, and it was 2 weeks with no social media, with no emails, with no world news. And Anita, it was bliss.
Lovely.
And I could feel my nervous system just like go, oh. And in an ideal world, that'd be prescribed on the NHS.
Yeah.
Meditation retreats would be prescribed on the NHS, that employers would give their employees time to have yoga classes at work, all these different ways that we can encourage. Let's slow down a bit. Let's try and almost pull ourselves back, because I do actually think we're close to the precipice. I do really feel we're like standing at these crumbling cliffs, and we're being distracted by our devices. We've got our, hands over our eyes and hands over our ears, the 3 monkeys.
Yes. And,
you know, things are happening, and we need to wake up. We need to wake up. We need to realize where power is. We need to realize as individuals, we can have impact in many different ways.
Yeah, I think that's something that you just said, you know, that many of us, and I know that from the conversations, you know, with other practitioners, with people in my personal life, you know, so many of us feel powerless, because it's not that it's something new that we see the corruption and we see the distraction and we see the greed and we see the, you know, the ugly face of capitalism, bigger, louder, better, more for me. It's that because of the internet and the media, we see it very clearly. Like, 20, 30 years ago, we heard about this, maybe we read about this, we kind of knew about this, but it wasn't so much in our face. Whereas now, the sheer amount of data coming to us so fast and from every single direction, and seeing all of this, not to mention just Trump and the political agenda in this country, and I'm Polish, so political agenda in Poland, and all of that kind of stuff, the corruption and the greed and the distraction, that willful blindness as well, not that we see, that is in our face. And I think that's what I struggle with quite a lot, that we see it, and so many of us feel really kind of hopeless and helpless, powerless to change it because it's all around us.
So some suggested strategies, well, let's talk about yoga, is giving practitioners lots of options. Encouraging practitioners to take control of their practice. So rather than like, you must do this, I have said this frequently in yoga classes, of if you're in a yoga class and you ask the teacher, is there an option? And the teacher says there is not an option. There certainly is an option, which is leave that class now. Don't wait. Because in my view, that's unsafe to be in a class where the teacher has an ideology that there are no options. So I'm a great believer in options, and I encourage practitioners to question teachers. So, that's a little way of empowering yoga practitioners rather than like poses being imposed. It's like, go into this inner dialogue, have this conversation. How's this feeling in my body? Does this feel beneficial, or is this damaging my body? So that's a little thread in the kind of the big mountains of like empowering ourselves as practitioners, as human beings, and Sangha, community, connection, which is one of the great things about this Buddhist group that we've been talking about, Tri Ratna, that they really emphasize community. And within the Buddha's own teachings, there was the kind of the three jewels, was it Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and that famous teaching of, well, what's the most important? So there's Ananda saying to the Buddha, what's the most important of these three? And the Buddha said, Sangha. So good spiritual friends, connection, support. So a way to empower ourselves is to be out on the street, to be marching with other people. So I've been peripherally involved in groups like Just Stop Oil. I've been involved in groups like Extinction Rebellion. I've been on marches in this month calling for ceasefire. And for myself personally, within the ceasefire is also about releasing hostages. So I want to try and get us away from the kind of yes-no binary. And I want us to see whatever skin color, whatever religion we might have grown up in, we all bleed the same. We're all human. And we need to realize that, because if we do not realize that, then things are going to get extremely tricky. So that realization that our blood is all the same. We're human beings. I read recently, I think all human is something I can't remember, something like 99% identical DNA. Whether we're Polish, so I grew up in this country, my dad was Scottish, my mum was Welsh, whether someone's grown up in South Asia, East Asia, North America, South America, we're all human. And as well as being human, we are part of nature. We are not apart from nature. So this is what, let's talk about the C word, capitalism. You know, capitalism has taken us out of nature. And there's the whole human hubris. And what happens in terms of, I don't know how much you know of the kind of Greek myths, but what follows hubris, which is, let's say, arrogance, is war. Mm. And we need to be aware that we are part of the web. We're not above the web. We are very much in the web.
Yes, well, we are the web. We're not separate, and living in line with nature and the seasons, and really allowing ourselves to find that rhythm. Yeah. You know, often our lives are so busy that we are so disconnected from our rhythm that, you know, something drastic has to happen to actually make us stop. Yeah.
That's something, just going back to yin yoga, that I really appreciate the philosophy of the 5 elements or the 5 phases, and that sense of connectivity within it, in terms of water feeding wood, and wood being the fuel for fire, and then fire becoming earth, and earth eventually becoming metal, and metal containing water, and on we go. And then the cycles within that cycle. So there's a real sense of this web of all these different threads connecting. And honestly, it took me a decade plus to understand this. So maybe I'm a slow learner. Maybe it takes me a long time to pick up these things. I'm sure there are a few people who pick them up straight away, but it took me years and years of practice and of study to get some real feeling for that. And then as I did, it was like, oh, as much as I remember when I first had an understanding of, like, say, the nervous systems. So again, obviously that links to trauma, but the nervous systems. And then it was like, oh, that's interesting. And that's something that sometimes worries me. I see, let's say as an example, a yoga teacher saying, I can train yoga teachers to teach yin yoga in a day.
Yes, I love that.
I do think if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Yes. Yes. I mean, what you are talking about is that difference between understanding something on a mind level and then embody something, really understand it through our felt experience. Like, you know, if I think about, I had the privilege of as well studying with Sarah Powers. You know, I went for a 10-day retreat in Greece with her, and you know, I've already read books on yin yoga. I've already been practicing yin yoga for a few years before I went, but actually going there and going through the training and immersing myself in the practices. And one of the things that she did was like asking us to put our phones away and not having contact with the outside world. I was like, oh my God, can I do that for 10 days? You know, that was very different. I came back different from that retreat. And I remember one of my students saying to me, oh, you suddenly became very spiritual. And I was like, I haven't, but being on that retreat gave me permission to actually start talking about things that I've been holding very privately for many years, but didn't feel that I had the language or permission to share it, didn't feel safe enough to share it. And then, you know, I was able to kind of say, well, actually, it's important. I want to share it. I want to talk about this. Because as you just said, you know, it's yoga practice, meditation practice, psychotherapy, all those practices help us to connect within and help us then to take it out of that room, away from the mat, into our daily lives. And you know, if more of us did that, maybe the world would be in a different place. Maybe, you know, there would be more reflection. Maybe people would follow their values in a different way. Maybe we would communicate in a different way. And maybe, just maybe, we would slow down a little bit. Slow down just a little bit to make a difference.
It takes time, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think when people offer quick fixes,
Mm-hmm.
almost regardless of what they're offering, maybe they're offering ayahuasca, maybe they're offering a therapy weekend, maybe they're offering whatever they might be offering, but quick fixes, this takes time.
Just like trauma healing, just like changing identity, I think like what people really misunderstand is this quick insight. And then that can happen in a moment. You know, you see something in a different way, something shifts, but then there is a process of integration, isn't it?
After the exit of the laundry.
Yes, exactly.
After the exit. So definitely insights happen. I've had insights, but after the insights, we have to come home, we have to wash the
Cook the
dishes,
dinner, yeah.
the dinner, all this kind of stuff. And what I feel is that in some ways, the quick fixes are very capitalist. Here we go. Here's the answer. And actually, is it? And you know what you talked about of really embodying a practice and the years of experience. So this is something we can come back to sustainability, that I see some very good yoga teachers having to work very hard to sustain themselves.
Yes.
And what worries me is that, say, teaching 20 classes a week or being endlessly on Instagram, presenting this identity on social media is exhausting. And the abilities of a yoga teacher are lost because it's unsustainable. And so, and obviously, of course, that links to pay rates.
Yes.
You know,
I know that you are quite connected, aren't you, with the Yoga Teachers Union?
Yes, yes.
Could you say a few words about that? Because it's I've been watching.
So I remember teaching at well, at that time it was called Holmes Place. Nowadays it's called Virgin Active. So I was teaching at Holmes Place in Crouch End in 2002. So over 20 years ago. It was a lovely class. I loved teaching there. It was a great group of people, very regular, very into the yoga practice. And I was paid £30 an hour. So 2002. Pay rates at Virgin Active now are variable to some extent, depending on how many classes you teach for them, you know, how experienced you are. Let's say a kind of sort of average of Virgin Active for an hour-long class is £28. So in over 20 years, the pay has gone down.
Yes.
You know, the price of travel, the price of food, the price of heating our homes, that hasn't gone down. So coming back to sustainability, because as yoga teachers, we can get better and better over time. You know, what worries me is when someone's been teaching for like 3 years and they're suddenly claiming that they're able to train other yoga teachers. I'm like, but you've only been teaching for like 3 years. You know, personally, and I know, and I'm sure there will be a few people who are extremely capable of doing that. So I know I'm making some like sweeping statements. For myself, I only started running training courses after I've been teaching for 12 years. And you can only experience. I am a great fan of going on trainings, you know, like as an example, this year, I've been on 3 separate yin yoga trainings and I loved them. And I learned ideas from each of them. And I really appreciated with three different teachers, including Sarah Powers, actually. So 20 years on, I'm still in the kind of Sarah Powers orbit. And it's like going back and like looking at what we're doing. However, we cannot train experience.
Yes, I completely agree with you. Completely. I mean, there is no shortcut for experience. You have to experience it. You have to embody it. You have to go through it. And it's like, you know, you're talking about in the context of obviously teaching yoga teachers. I feel the same about like trauma-informed approach. You know, I have 25 years of working with people with trauma, 16 years frontline in social care, and then in the community. And I see people who, you know, try to train others in yoga teachers in certain approaches, you know, in trauma-informed approach. And I know that they hardly, you know, worked with anybody who's experienced trauma. And again, there is so much you can learn from the workshop, so much you can learn from books, from webinars, from courses. But that's not the same as an experience. It's the same as, you know, teaching somebody downwards facing dog. Unless you've done it thousands of times, you don't know. And then unless you taught it, you know, to others, you showed it to others with their specific individual bodies and their specific individual needs, with the specific needs for specific adjustments, because of their individual bodies and needs, you know, you will not have enough experience. It's like, and that's something that, you know, in our, what you just said, in our fast living society, wanting results really quickly, you know, when we talk about the business model, I mean, I, just like you, I support other practitioners in sustainable business models. And it's like, there are thousands of ways that you can work. Each one of us has got different commitments, family commitments, health issues, challenges, you know, time constraints, understanding different way that we like to work. And it's like, there isn't enough of that understanding. And in fact, I did a podcast episode last week about talking about this, that it's like, you know, what does sustainability mean to you? It might mean to you something very different than it means to me. And when it comes down to, you know, business and how we work, like so many of us as practitioners talk about self-compassion and self-care and prioritizing how we look after ourselves and you know, being kind to ourselves and walking with integrity, living with integrity, working with integrity, and finding our own pace and living in rhythm with nature. And then what we do in business, we just like a completely different person pushing. And as you just said, you know, being on Instagram, teaching unrealistic amount of classes that cannot be, like, I'm 50. I am not going to teach 20 classes. There is no way that I could possibly do that. You know, it's like there's so much in here that I think there isn't enough conversation about it. I think there is a model that is being taught to new yoga teachers, and then they take it on with just teaching lots of classes. And that unrealistic expectation that, you know, you're going to be able to support yourself straight away from teaching those classes. And I think that comes really, again, with experience, with integration, trying things out, reflecting, learning, changing things, you know, just like our bodies change over time and just like our needs change over time, so commitments change over time. It's
rather than teaching lots of classes, we could be asking for pay increases.
Yes.
And we could be asking for transparency. And yet what I sometimes find is that people use these words, like you talked, like integrity, transparency, and they don't actually mean it. It's just another word, like authentic. It's just another, oh, here's a thing to say. And I heard someone talk about transparency, but when they were actually asked what rates they were paying people, they refused to say. It's like, let's actually walk our talk.
Yeah.
And let's have the courage to aspire to do things differently.
Yeah.
Rather than just like running around, like sometimes like headless chickens, struggling to keep our heads above water.
Yeah.
It's like, let's, again, coming back to this idea of let's pause. And, you know, for myself, I think what's crucial in terms of teaching is like including people. And obviously, when we're teaching a group class, there's lots of different people, lots of different circumstances. And if we're going along to that class and we're tired, if we're going along to that class and we're resentful because our pay rates are so low, if we're going along to that class and we feel just like depleted and overwhelmed, it's going to be harder for us to really practice inclusivity. Yes. And then I think within inclusivity, there's the possibility of making what we're teaching accessible to people. And then again, let's be practical about things. So for myself, you know, when I'm running my own workshops or trainings, you know, I do like bursary rates. I do concession places. And the concession plates isn't like just knocking off £3 because that's not a concession. It's just a token. It's actually making it really accessible, doing our best to make it accessible to people. And I think within all this is this sense of within like aspiring to be inclusive, it's like seeing the uniqueness of each human being. And we each come along with our own stories, our own situations, our own levels of trauma. And some people, as you'll have seen this, obviously, you know, with high levels of trauma, and some people much less trauma. But, you know, we've all got, you know, differing degrees of trauma. And we've all had our own challenges. And I just really want us to, slow down, to really look at ways of breaking the reactivity, of connecting with each other, of understanding. As I said earlier, we all bleed the same blood.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you, Norman, and I think it's such a powerful message. You know, it's such a simple thing, and yet it's so difficult within the society that we live in because the messaging from every single side is opposite of that. But before we finish, I wanted to ask for you to share where people can find your work. You know, it's if somebody wanted to connect with you and maybe come to some of your offerings or some of your trainings, where can they find you?
So my website is imaginatively called Yoga with Norman. So was it www.yogawithnorman.co.uk. So I teach workshops, I teach classes, I teach retreats, I teach courses in yin yoga. So all the details are there. I have a book called Brightening Our Inner Skies, Yin and Yoga. I also have a monthly newsletter. So that's a way of keeping in touch with dates of workshops. And also, if you might be interested in hearing my ideas about this world and life in yoga land, that's one of the ways I communicate those ideas.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking time to speaking with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great. Thank you.